Thanks for joining our presentation today. My name is Natalie from Orchid Systems. Today, Anne and I are going to share some tips and demonstrate how to implement Orchid's EFT processing for Sage Intacct. The core of EFT processing is to generate a file in the format required by your banks to upload to the banking software. It works with accounts payable to facilitate payments to vendors and suppliers, with accounts receivable to handle direct debit transactions from customers, and with employee expenses to process reimbursements efficiently. To get started with EFT processing, you need to obtain the bank specifications for the transactions that you process by EFT. You need to collect information from your vendors, your customers, your employees, depending on what you're processing. You can then install the EFT Processing custom components and enter the license details in Sage Intacct. And then you can configure EFT Processing in Sage Intacct and start generating files. In the first part of this presentation, we're going to focus on the information you need to gather before you start implementing the software in Sage Intacct. You're going to be collecting from your bank the bank specifications for the file format and some company-specific details such as your account number and some other transaction references. From your vendors, employees and customers, you will be collecting the bank details to pay them or to process the direct debit. And then you will need the Sage Intacct company ID so that we can validate your subscription license and provide an activation code. When you start a subscription for EFT processing, the first question we generally ask you is to send the bank specifications. What is it and why do we need it? The specification document outlines the format, the layout of the file that the bank requires for the transactions you're going to be processing with them. Specification can be in different format, a PDF file, an Excel file, a Word document, a list to a website. It generally includes a description of the fields that are required, in what order, the field length, the type of data, the extension that is required, TXT, ACH, XML file, and other requirements specific to the standard that the bank is using, to the country, and to the type of transaction. If you're currently sending EFT files to the bank from another system, a sample file is useful. It is not sufficient, but it helps us in the reconciliation and the testing. If you're not currently using EFT transfers, the best starting point is to ask your bank account manager to explain their requirements to enable EFT processing on your accounts. Why does Orchid need the bank specs? Most banks accept different file formats depending on the client's account type and the transaction types they're processing. And the bank specification helps us confirm the compatible file type to use with EFT processing. This ensures that it will be accepted by your bank as quickly as possible. Out of the box, Orchid's EFT processing supports over 800 bank formats for a variety of banks from over 80 countries. The file formats supported include domestic payments in many countries, cross-border payments, international payments, positive pay, pre-notes, wire, ACH, NACHA, CPA 005 in Canada, SEPA and SEPA Direct Debit in Europe, ISO 222, BPay in Australia, etc. Just knowing the bank name is not sufficient, as for many banks we have several file types. So the specs help us determine if we already have a format matching the specs, if the format needs some adjustment based on how you process your transactions, or if we need to create a new one. If the format is not currently supported, we can develop it fairly quickly according to your bank specifications using our WebAssembly mapping engine. So it is not a completely new development. It is included in your subscription of EFT processing, and it generally takes a few days for us to generate the new file, and then you need to take into account, plan a little bit of time to test with the bank as part of your implementation. In addition, Your bank will provide many of the client's details that are required in the file. Of course, you'll need your branch code and your account number, but depending on the format, there may be other fields that are required as well. Your ACH ID, the bank ISO country code, your checks form codes, the check delivery method, the branch ID. The exact details depend on the format and the bank. You may also discuss some options with the bank to support your specific payment processes, and depending on the answers to that, it may require some adjustments to the format. For example, do you send files to the bank in advance? Do you need to set the payment date in the file, or are you going to take the payment date on the transactions you're entering? Do you do cross-border international payments? To what countries, in what currencies? Some of the requirements in some file types are different for different countries. What are the bank's requirements regarding your file name, the file extension? Does it have to be ACH? Do they use a file sequence number, and does it have to be in the file name? Will you be generating pre-notes to validate the details of new vendors and customers, or for large amounts? And we have a specific presentation on the website on generating pre-notes in Sage Intacct. Once you've collected all this information from the bank, after installing EFT Processing, you can then add the format that we're going to send you and the bank details in Sage Intacct, and Anne will show us how to do this a little bit later. Next, you need to gather the banking details from your vendors for AP payments, customers for AR Direct Debit, and employee bank details for employee expenses. So you need to have the bank details of the entities you want to pay or direct debit. Many banks have a template that you can send to your vendors or your customers to collect the information if you are new to EFT processing. The exact details, again, depend on your bank and the format you're using. But in all cases, you'll need the account holder's names, the bank name, bank ID, the branch name, the account number. For international transfers, this generally is the IBAN or the SWIFT code, depending on the countries. If you are using EFT for direct debit of customers, they generally need to sign a direct debit agreement when providing their bank details, for example, SEPA mandates in Europe. You can gather all this information in a spreadsheet, as you can import the bank details in Orchid's EFT directly in Sage Intacct from a CSV file. You need a license code to use EFT processing for Sage Intacct to generate the files, and you can purchase separate subscriptions for AP vendor payments, AR customer direct debits, or employee expenses reimbursements. The available features will depend on your license code. You cannot auto-generate a trial license. However, you can start configuring everything without a valid code. You can create a new format, enter the bank details, import the EFT details for vendor, customer, and employees without a valid license code. However, you can't generate the file or download, hold, and refresh without a valid activation code. To get the activation code, you need to send us the Sage Intacct company ID. We can then generate the appropriate license code. So you can get that on the company setup general information and send us the ID. If you have an active subscription for EFT processing, we will also provide you a code, a fully functional code for your implementation or your sandbox instance. And again, we will just need a screenshot of the implementation company ID name that you are using. So this is an example. If you are using Intacct in French, be it in Quebec or in France, and it's going to be the ID de société. So now you've gathered all the necessary information from your bank. So we've given you the file format to use. You have all the details from your vendors, employees, and customers. You've provided us with a Sage Intacct company ID and you have a valid license. You can install and configure EFT processing. And for this, I'm going to hand over to Anne.
Thanks, Natalie. In this video, I'm going to show you how to install and configure EFT processing for Sage Intacct. After downloading the application from the Orchid website, you would use Platform Services, the Applications option, to install the Orchid EFT application. And then you need to check some web service settings in Company Information. And then you need to set up the Orchid EFT security roles that are needed for users to use Orchid EFT Processing. And there's also some security roles that you need access to in Sage Intacct in order to generate the files. After the installation, we're going to see the different EFT options: EFT license, where to enter the activation code, EFT formats, how to upload your EFT formats that you're going to use, and EFT banks, configuring those banks to use the required formats. And after that, we'll look at configuring the AP vendors, the AR customers, and their time and expense employees using the Orchid EFT tab on those master files and how to set the configuration. And then you're set to do the process of payments and creating the EFT file, which will be covered off in another video. To download the Orchid EFT application, you go to the Orchid website and log in. And then in the product downloads, you would download the Intacct XML application. The XML application is zipped, so you need to unzip it and then install that unzipped file. And then in the required Sage Intacct instance, logged in as a full administrator user, you can go to Platform Services, install an application, then choose that file that you've just unzipped, and then click Install. This process takes just under a minute, and it will send you an email showing you the objects that have been created and updated. So here's all the objects that have been created, and you have the same list in the email that is sent. And after uploading the application, you should check in Company that the web services, Ajax web service, is activated. So in the Company Information Security tab, ensure that the Ajax web service is active. If you do not see the Ajax web service or do not have the platform services in your menu, then see the Sage Intacct help in enabling these particular web services. If you are signed on as a CPA user or as an external user, you will immediately have access to the Orchid EFT menu. But if you are an internal user, you need to assign rights to your user ID before you can see the Orchid EFT menu. When you install Orchid EFT, a role is created for Orchid EFT, and if you view those subscriptions, you have all the EFT objects and the menu items. And from here you can create roles for the appropriate users. In this case, we're going to ensure that we have a user that has access to everything. And we're going to assign that Orchid EFT role to our user, Anne Fouché. And once you have the role, you would go to the appropriate users and ensure that the role is assigned to them. And after installing the Orchid EFT XML application and configuring your Ajax user, and assigning security permissions, if you are getting permission errors or page not found errors, you need to refresh your browser or log off and log on again. And in addition to access to the Orchid EFT objects, if you click on the Help on any of the Orchid EFT screens, you will see the Sage Intacct security roles that are required in order for Intacct users to be able to generate an EFT file. They need to be able to list and view the transaction currencies. They need to be able to drill down to transactions from reports in the general ledger, and they need cash management permissions on the checking account, list and view. The first configuration you need to do is to enter the activation code. The activation code will be sent to you once you have given us the company ID, and you get the company ID from Sage Intacct from the company screen. If you do not have your activation code yet, you will still be able to do all the configuration needed for formats, banks, vendors, customers, and employees, but you will not be able to create an EFT file until you have the activation code. To apply the activation code, you edit on the company screen and you paste the activation code into this box. And once you save, EFT will tell you what features have been enabled based on the activation code, whether the client has purchased AP payments and or AR receipts and or employee expenses. The EFT license screen also tells you if there are any updates available based on the update that is installed on this instance. In this case, I am on the latest product update and there are no updates available. The next configuration you need to do is to upload the EFT file formats that you need. And to do that, you use the EFT format screen. Here are the formats that I have already uploaded into the Sage Intacct instance, but to add a new one, you click Add, and then from the text file that we send you, you copy the contents into the file format box. And then for consistency, we would recommend that you keep the file format name the same. So I'm copying the name into the name box without the square brackets, and the description as well. So this is the format for the HSBC ISO 20022 multi-payment type format. And this is the file format name that you would then associate with the appropriate Sage Intacct checking account. And the next step is to associate that EFT file format with the appropriate bank account. And in our case, we're going to associate the HSBC 2022 with our 500 checking account. So we're going to go and add. From our banks drop-down, we choose the appropriate bank account. For accounts receivable, we would say this is a receipt type EFT file, as opposed to for payables and employee reimbursements, we'd select payment. And then we'd choose the appropriate file format, in our case, the HSBC. And now you'd fill in the appropriate information that the bank has provided you to create an EFT file that suits this particular format. The routing number, the account number, the AR receipt reference number, and so on. When you select the file format for a bank, EFT Processing turns on the appropriate fields for that particular EFT file type. And in this case, because the HSBC ISO 20022 multi allows you to create an ACH file for local payments and an ISO 2022 for overseas payments, that is why we need to fill in both the ACH ID as well as the BIC or SWIFT number. So we need to fill in the appropriate information. With EFT Processing, you can define what the EFT file name is to be, In our case, we'll go HSBC multi, which file format this is. And then we can include variables such as the date and time, so we can easily identify the file. And we also have access to a daily sequence number and a file sequence number to keep track of the file. If this file format uses a file sequence number, you can change the number it starts from. And you'd fill in the appropriate SWIFT number and routing number as provided by the HSBC. Your 10-digit organization ID that the HSBC provides you, your 2-digit ISO country code, whether or not the HSBC in this instance is going to produce check forms for you, and the file authorization level as agreed with HSBC. If the EFT file format needs the company address, as some of them do, especially for overseas payments, we suggest you copy from the company here, so that if the EFT file is produced at an entity level as opposed to the top level, the user will have access to the company address. And you would repeat that, adding the EFT file format to all the appropriate banks, either as a payment type or a receipt type, depending on whether you're doing a direct debit for customers or a payment to vendors and employees. The reason you may have multiple formats for the same bank account, in this case 100 CHK has the ISO 2022 and the NACHA, is that you would use one format, the ISO 202 for overseas payments, and the NACHA format for domestic payments in America. So you would have multiple EFT file formats associated with the same bank to cover all the file types you need to create, including being able to produce the NACHA direct debits, so you would have a receipt payment type configuration. And for more help on all these fields, you can click on the Help button, and in the Help it will tell you for the EFT banks all the fields that are needed, including the different file variables that you can use in the file name. And that covers off the installation of the Orchid application, the roles and security you need to set for Orchid EFT objects, the roles and security you need to set on the Sage Intacct objects, and we've seen how to update the license file, to create your formats, and how to configure the banks. Now we're going to go and look at configuring the vendors, customers, and employees with their EFT details. The way Orchid EFT works with accounts payable, accounts receivable, and employee expenses is to add an Orchid EFT tab on the vendors, customers, and employees. So first, looking at accounts payable, looking at our vendors, I have created a view showing all the EFT fields that I need. So using this as an inquiry shows me which vendors have been configured and which ones haven't. And if we look at vendor 2001, we see on the Orchid EFT tab that this vendor has been configured for the NACHA format, and the appropriate fields for the NACHA format have been filled in. EFT is able to give you help on some of the fields. For example, the EFT file format for NACHA needs to know the transaction code, whether the deposit is destined for a checking account, which is 22, or 32 for a savings account. But if we edit a vendor which has not been configured, on the Orchid EFT tab, you first select the EFT file format that you're going to use. In our case, we'll choose the HSB ISO 2022 multi. And then you fill in the appropriate fields that are required for a vendor to do a deposit based on this format. So the EFT file format needs to know who is going to bear the charge. In this case, is it shared, is the debtor bearing it, or is the creditor bearing it? So we'll make this one shared, and we'll fill in the banking details for this vendor accordingly. Because this is a domestic vendor, we only need to fill in the account number and the routing number. The rest of the fields, the IBAN or SWIFT, BC, the bank address, etc., is only used if this was an overseas vendor. And then save the EFT details for the vendor. If your EFT details view contains all the columns that need data for your EFT vendors, you can export this file to Excel and then use the exported Excel file as a template to capture all your information for your vendors and then re-import. So you'd use Excel to fill in the missing columns, perhaps delete those columns that you don't want to re-import, save the Excel spreadsheet, and then go back to Sage Intacct and import using that Excel template. Similarly, for your accounts receivable direct debits, you can configure your customers in the same way as you do your vendors. So in accounts receivable, the first thing you would do is create an AR EFT details view, which shows all the columns that you need to fill in for accounts receivable. And then you could go and edit the customers. And on the Orchid EFT tab, you can see the EFT configuration. In this case, this customer is configured for the Nature format. And the fields have been filled in, the account number and the branch number, as well as the account transaction code, determining which type of account they have. And having a look at a customer that has been configured for the SEPA file format. On the Orchid EFT tab, we can see that the file format is SEPA, and in this case, we have the BIC SWIFT code filled in, as well as the IBAN number and the 2-character country code for Australia. And having a look at a customer that is not yet configured for EFT, we can edit the customer. And on the Orchid EFT tab, select the file format. In this case, we're going to use SEPA, and fill in the details accordingly. And when we have filled in a few of the EFT details for a few customers using the different formats needed, we can export using the AR details view the details to Excel, and then use this Excel template to import the data. So we can capture using Excel, copy and paste from where we have these details previously, and then save the spreadsheet and import. And in a similar way, we can configure our employees. So in time and expenses employees, we can create an EFT view, which has the columns that we need for displaying the EFT details in the list view. And if we edit one of these employees on the Orchid EFT tab, we see that this employee has been configured for the Nature ACH IAT, and for that we need to fill in the account name, the account number, the 2-character country code, the receiving DFID identifier, whether it's 01, 02 or 03, and the transaction code of the destination account, whether it's checking or savings, 22 or 32. And after filling in a few of the employees with the different EFT file formats that we need, you can export to Excel and then use this template to copy and paste the details from where you have those details for your employees, save the spreadsheet, and then import back into Sage Intacct Employees. And that's it. We have seen how to import the Orchid EFT application, configure the security, set up the license formats in banks, set up the vendors, customers, and employees, and you're now ready to process payments. In this next video, I'm going to show you how to create AR direct debit files for your bank. That is, to do direct debits against your customers. In Sage Intacct, you would enter, post, and approve the payments for your customers. And then in EFT Processing, you would select those payments, generate the EFT file, download the EFT file, upload it to the bank, and when the bank says all the file entries were correct, then you could confirm the file. But it does presuppose that you have already installed and configured Orchid EFT. So let's go ahead and look at how this is done. Initially, you must go to the appropriate customers and fill in the Orchid EFT file type to use in order to process direct debits for those customers. So looking at ABC Square, for example, on the Orchid EFT tab, we have configured the format NACHA for the North American Clearinghouse for those direct debits. And looking at CVibe, this customer has been configured for the SEPA format. Orchid EFT Processing allows you to process direct debits for customers who are configured for EFT and for banks that are configured for EFT. So first what you do is raise your invoices for your customers, and then you would go ahead and enter the payments for those invoices. What Orchid EFT Processing allows you to do is to process payments that are posted for customers who are configured for EFT with banks that are configured for EFT. It allows you to process those payments into an EFT file. And to do that, you use the AR payment request option in the Orchid EFT menu. The AR payment request screen shows you all those payments for customers who are configured for EFT, for banks that is configured for EFT, which have not yet been generated into an EFT file, if you have selected not in any file. And it's filtering by default in the last calendar month, but you can change that if your payments were processed with an earlier date. And from here, you could filter by currency or by payment method or by customer type, or you could just select all the payments and click generate, and it would generate those payments into an EFT file. What EFT Processing does is groups the payments together by bank account and by format. So we would get one file for the 100 CHK Bank, NACHA format, one file for the 600 CHK Bank for the St. George Payway format, and one file for the 510 CHK Bank in the SEPA French format. And finally, one for the 100 CHK Bank in the SEPA format. These transactions here, these payments here, where the EFT file type is scored out, means that I have a payment for a customer, Alinta Gas, which is configured for EFT, but this particular bank, 800 CHK, has not been configured for the St. George Payway format. So it's not able to generate a file for those. So let's go ahead and select them all except for the ones that we do not have the configuration correctly set up. And we'll go ahead and click Generate. And as discussed, we will get 4 EFT files created for these selected payments. And when I click OK, those payments that have now been included, because I'm seeing not included in any EFT file, they drop off the list. And I will see them on the EFT file list. So when we go to the EFT file list, because this is sorted with the most recent created file first, we see those 4 files at the top of the list. And the status is new. And we could view this file. And in this case, we see the details for our 600 CHK bank, and then the details for each of the customers that have been included in this file. And we could go ahead and download the file. When we download the file, the status will go from new to exported. And if we open up this file, we will see it's formatted for the St. George Payway format. And the EFT file includes the variables that you used when you defined the EFT file name on the EFT bank. And now, assuming we upload that to the bank, and the bank says it has uploaded 5 transactions with a total of 5,617 AU dollars, and we could come and confirm. Once we confirm the file, you can still view and download with the correct security permissions, but the file is for all intents and purposes complete. And having a look at the SEPA FR format, we see that there's a handful of payments here. We can see the bank details and all the different customer details with their euro-dollar payments. And if we're happy with that file, we can click Download as well. Named according to the definition on the EFT bank. And if we open it up, we see this is an XML file formatted for SEPA in France. So assuming we loaded that file up to the bank, and the bank said the SWIFT code on one of those customers was incorrect, or indeed the information from the bank record, our own EFT bank record, was incorrect, what we can do is hold the file, and putting it on hold allows us to go and amend some of the EFT details in that file, either on the individual customers or on the bank record. So we're going to go to the EFT bank record and change some details. Let's say the IBAN number was too short. And back on the EFT file, we can click Refresh. So if EFT Processing notices that some of the data has changed, it will make a copy of the file as it was then, and you always have that history file. So in the file number 10515, we always have the historic details, and we know that Anne created it on that date and time, but it's been replaced by this file. And if we view that file, we would see the amended, in this case, we amended the bank details. We see the 8 has now become a 9. And now we can download that file, and its status will go to exported and then upload to the bank. And when the bank is happy with that file, we could come back and confirm. And the status goes to confirmed. We could, for example, apply filters to the EFT file list Maybe we don't want to see all the confirmed ones. We only want to see the ones that we're working on, they're exported, new, or on hold. And when you apply a filter, the column header becomes in italics, so you know you're seeing a filtered list. And you can filter on multiple columns. So now I'm only seeing those files which were created by Anne and the status is exported, new, or on hold. And this is remembered by user. So tomorrow when I open the screen, these filters are still going to apply. So I'm just going to remove my filters and show you the Create AR Payment screen. Create AR Payment allows you to select invoices which are not yet fully paid off. And you can select and filter by customer type, customer name, invoice date, currency, and so on. So I'm currently filtering on the euro currency only. So here I can see all my invoices which are not yet paid. And what Create AR Payment allows you to do is quickly select invoices and create payments applied to those invoices. So it's one-to-one. It's not creating one payment applied to multiple customer invoices. If you have multiple invoices for one customer in the list, for example, 10086, it is going to create one receipt per invoice and create the receipt with the payment method specified and against the bank specified. So first I'm going to create record transfers for my 600 CHK demo bank, which is in Australian dollars. So I'm going to filter by Australian dollars. And I am going to select all those payments and click Create 5 payments. So it's one-to-one with the invoices. And now because I'm still filtering on my transaction currency, you can see that because it's in italics. I'm now going to select all my euro transactions, but this time I'm going to create it against my 510 euro bank account. And I could select all, or if I don't want to have two payments for 10086, I could manually select the ones that I want to select and go ahead and create these 5 payments. So this process is quicker than entering the individual customer receipts. And the last one I'm going to do is for my US dollars record transfer against my 100 CHK bank account. And I'm going to select all of these except this last one. I don't want two payments for Nirvana. And now when I go to my EFT AR payment requests, I have all those payments waiting, ready to go. And again, I could select all, or I could filter by currency or bank or payment method if I did want to do individual files at a single time. And I have just shown you the process of selecting payments and generating the EFT file once you have entered, posted and approved the payments for your customers that you wish to direct debit.
Thanks, Anne. We're now going to look at using EFT Processing to generate files for AP vendor payments.
So in Sage Intacct, you would enter, post and approve the payments for the vendors. And then in EFT Processing, you would select the payments required, you'd generate the EFT file, download the EFT file, and then upload that file into the bank. And once the bank says the file's okay, you would come back to the Orchid EFT file list and confirm the process. And this is the process I'm going to show you now. In Sage Intacct, in Accounts Payable, you would configure your vendors on the Orchid EFT tab. And here we suggest that you create a EFT details view which has all the columns that you need to fill in the EFT details for the vendor, so you can easily check which vendors have been configured and which vendors have not been configured. And you can find the EFT fields in the vendor object, as they are user-defined fields defined on the vendor. So if we go ahead and edit vendor 2001, on the Orchid EFT tab, you see we have selected NACHA, the North American Clearinghouse, for this particular vendor. And when you select the EFT file format, the appropriate fields get turned on, and you get tooltips for the fields that need required values. For example, the transaction code needs to be a 22 or a 32 to indicate whether the deposit is destined for a checking account or a savings account. And you need to fill in the account number and the route number for the NACHA payment type. And if we look at one of the UK formats, on the Orchid EFT tab, you can see there's a different number of fields that are needed. In this case, for the UK Coots International format, we need to know the IBAN number or the account number, the BIC code or SWIFT code or sort code, the destination country code, who's paying the charges, whether they're shared or are charges, and the priority, which is urgent or normal. And if we go to edit a vendor who has not yet got EFT details configured, on the Orchid EFT tab, we can select the required EFT file format. And in this case, if we choose the CAN CIBC Bank, we need to fill in the account name, the account number, which must be at least 7 characters long, the bank name, and the financial institution ID or transit number, which must be at least 7 characters long as well, and an optional payment reference. So EFT is able to turn on the required fields for the format that you select and give tooltips or help when the fields have required values. And after configuring your vendors for the formats that you need, so one example vendor for each of the formats that you need, you can use your EFT details view to export the configured vendors to an Excel template. And then in the Excel template, you can add the vendor's bank account details. You could remove any columns that you're not changing. You maybe have them here just for your reference. Save the Excel spreadsheet. And then you'd be able to import those values back in. And once all your vendors are configured for EFT, you would do your normal AP processing. In the bills or invoicing option, you would enter your invoices and you would use pay bills to pay those particular invoices when they are due. So EFT processing allows you to select posted payments for vendors that are configured for EFT and for banks that are configured for EFT, and create an EFT file for them. So if you have approvals on your invoices and or payments, those need to be done prior to creating the EFT file. And to create an EFT file, you go to the Orchid EFT menu, the AP Payment Requests option. And this screen will show you in your date range, which defaults to the last calendar month, and any other filters you have applied here. This screen will show you all those payments that have been posted for vendors that are configured for EFT, for banks that are configured for EFT, which have not yet been made. So if you want, you could filter by currency. If you only wanted to create your Australian dollar EFT file, or by payment method or vendor type, if you only wanted to do your subcontractors, for example. Or you could select all. And if I was to select all, when I click Generate, EFT Processing will create me the number of files that are needed per combination of file format and bank. So here we would get one file for the 100 CHK bank with the NACHA ACH IAT format. So all of these would be included in one file. We'd get a second file for our 500 CHK bank and the SEPA format. We'd get a third file for the 100 CHK bank and the NACHA format. One for 100 CHK and the CAN CIBC. One for 100 CHK and the UK Coots International format, and then we have a file for the single payment for our Australian ABA format, and two in another file for our BPay format for the NAB bank. So if I go ahead and click Generate, you can see EFT Processing is creating 7 files. We get a message to say the 7 files have been created, and when we click OK, we'll see that those payments drop off this list. And now in this date range, I don't have any payments outstanding waiting to go in an EFT file. But I can use this screen to view all, or those that are included in an EFT file. So if I choose Included in an EFT file, you will now see those same payments in this date range and the file they have been included in, 10528, and the status is new, 10531 and the status is new, and so on for the files that I have just created. And to see those files, you go to the Orchid EFT menu, EFT file list. And here we see all the files that have been created, again, in your filters or date ranges. And these filters are stored by user. And so the next time you come in, it will still be applying the same filter. So if you were only interested in seeing one bank, you could choose just that one bank. Or if you were only interested in the payments that you have created, you could filter by the name. But in my case, I'm viewing all the payments. And at the top of the list, here I see the files that I have just created because I'm sorting by date created, most recent first. So here we see the file for the 100 CHK bank, the Canadian CIBC format, the Australian NAB BPay, the American NACHA format, the European SEPA format, the UK Coots International format, and the NACHA ACH IAT that was generated, as well as the ABA file. From here we can view one of the files, we can view all of the files, and we can expand the section for the bank and see the details for the bank. We could expand each of the individual vendors' details to see the payment amount and the banking details that will be included. And then we can download that file. And when we download the file will be named based on what we defined on the EFT bank record for this particular format, in this case NACHA ACH IAT, and today's date and a sequence number, and the status will go to exported. We can open the file and we see it's formatted based on the NACHA ACH IAT format, including the address for the international payments. And if we load that up to the bank, and the bank says that it's loaded up 4 payments with a total of 2,331 cents, then we could come and confirm this file. But if the bank said there was a problem with one of those vendors' details, or indeed with your details on the EFT bank, we could click Hold and then go to one of the vendor's records or the bank record and make the appropriate change. So by clicking on that link, the EFT bank record is opening up, and if we go and edit it, and if the bank had said that the client ID was incorrect, these 10 characters is not correct, so it in fact ends with a 00. When we go back to the EFT file list, we can refresh the file. So refresh will make a copy of the file at that point in time with the details that are in, and create a new file with the new refreshed details. So now I have a new file 10537, which I can view and look at the bank details, and we can see this one now has 00 at the end of the client ID. And this new file, the status of the file is new, and the history of the file shows us that the previous file was 10528 and the file has been replaced. And if I was to view this one, we would see this is the one where the bank ID is 999. And now I could go ahead and download this file. Open it up, make sure that the details are now correct, upload to the bank, and if the bank says yes, that file is correct, I could then come back and confirm. And that's the process for creating EFT files for AP vendors. Once the configuration is complete, you would go ahead and in Sage Intacct, you would post and approve the AP payments for your vendors, and then using the EFT screens, the EFT AP payments requests, you would select the payments to be generated into a file, generate the EFT files, then use the EFT file list to download the EFT file, and once uploaded to the bank and confirmed that the bank can process that file, you confirm the process.
Thanks, Anne, for this detailed presentation on configuring and using Orchid's EFT for Sage Intacct. There's a whole lot more information on the Orchid website. In particularly at the bottom, if you go to the Learn More section, you have links to the brochure and the various videos for detailed presentation. You can also find some specific resources here. So on the videos page of the website, select EFT Processing for Sage Intacct, and you have quite a few spotlight videos. They're generally 10 to 15 minutes presentations on topics of interest, like using SFTP to upload a file, using cloud services, using EFT, Orchid's EFT to generate positive pay files, pre-notes, etc. The online help is also available from within the application and from the Orchid website, and a lot of what we presented today is available here. And we are now available for questions.